celebration here.
Good Friday, everyone. It's not Good Friday, but it's a
All right, thanks, BJ. You are on a roll. And let me back up just a bit. In my opinion, every Friday is a good Friday, right? We would all kind of agree with that. Well, we are honored and thrilled and very, very happy to have today's special guest, as you said, BJ Tom Griesgraber. Tom, welcome to Mom at
Yeah.
Home.
Thanks for having me. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. I'm gonna let you really talk about the instrument, obviously, because it's your expertise. I just want to give a little background on you and actually go back a step further. Your connection with the Museum of Making Music goes all the way back to your mom having been a volunteer, Peggy Borden.
Right.
According to Carolyn, was somewhere around 2001, 2002 she began
Yeah,
volunteering.
for a number of years. It's a little blurry to me because she retired in '96, I think, and then actually had two volunteer jobs. She did the museum and she did the volunteer sheriff. So,
Career as your path as a musician.
oh yeah.
How much, I mean, let's look back at that for a second. How much did that sort of influence you, get you excited to keep going down this path, having mom's support like that?
Oh, well, if you're talking about the stick specifically, I mean, I was going to say the stick specifically, it would be everything, but I mean, the whole music career is because she was in science, my dad was in science, it's a totally different world, and I kind of took this weird left turn, but they were both behind it. They were both supportive of it. And yeah, it with the stick specifically, I got into it at a weird time in life because I'd actually been to a music college in Boston, Berkeley, as a guitar player, and I came home from that, and a year or so later discovered the stick, and it was at that point in your life where you should be getting your career going and doing things, and I decided to kind of like take a break and learn a new instrument, but she was okay with that. So the fact that at the most basic level, she kind of kept the lights on and the roof over my head while I learned a new instrument. That's how I'm here.
And you can't get much better support than that. That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah,
So let me back up, not back up, I'm sorry, but let's go back to your college career and then we're going to jump into the
sure.
instrument itself. So you were an honors graduate from Berklee College of Music,
Yep.
1995. And as your bio says, and I love the way it's worded here, you became weary of conventional methods and you were compelled to seek out a more atypical means of making music,
Right,
which is when you discovered the Chapman Stick after seeing Tony Levin.
right.
So you took this amazingly bold leap. You set aside the guitar and you jumped into the stick. And as you said here, I believe every one of us has a purpose in life, and we concentrate on doing what we are called to do. No matter the risks, things work out for the best, and
Right.
I have to agree with that.
Yeah.
Quick little rundown of some of the amazing people you've played with, and we'll get into the instrument itself. On the list here, I see California Guitar Trio, whom we have hosted several times at the museum. The Tony Levin Band, the Dixie Dregs, Al Di Meola, Stanley Jordan, Bill Bruford's Earthworks, Larry Carlton, Steve Luthiker, Muriel Anderson, who we've also had at the museum several times, Tower Power, Asia, Burt Lambs. It's a very impressive list. So,
Yeah,
Tom,
well, I mean,
thank
there's
you.
a little, I mean, a little disclaimer there is that some of those names are people I've played with, and some of them are people I've opened shows for. But yeah, the opening act thing has been kind of crazy because I realized early on the stick is such a novel thing that as soon as I get in front of any kind of crowd and start doing music on it, then people get interested. So venues would start hiring me for as an opening act for everything from like jazz people like Al Di Meola or Stanley Jordan to progressive rock people to one of the more unusual but great ones was actually Paul Stanley from Kiss, which was that was fun. But it's been kind of all over the place. As you know, here's this weird guy with this weird instrument as the opening act. So it's good.
Well, I applaud your humility. I did mean to say open for
Yeah,
certain people, but I got ahead of myself. It is such a great list. I had to go with it.
yeah.
So, tell us what it was like stepping away from guitar and jumping into the stick. Some of the similarities, some of the differences between the two instruments, and do you still pick up the guitar?
Yeah. Yes. Yes is the simple answer to the guitar question. But the broader story is that post Berkeley, I spent a year down at San Diego State, still on guitar, doing their master's jazz program. And I decided after a year, I felt like I wanted to take a year off, thinking I was just going to practice guitar more because I'd always been kind of this player that did rock, did jazz, did classical, kind of went all over the map. And the state program was so focused on jazz, I thought, well, let me focus on jazz a little bit and kind of, polish myself there a bit. But it was during that year that I found the stick. I actually had a NAMM show. I saw it and I got it thinking it would be just sort of a double to guitar, something I would pull out once in a while. And it's a funny story and I'll leave them nameless, but I was playing with a local pop rock group at the time. And I got so excited about the stick that as we were writing material, I started showing up to rehearsals with it going, well, I know I'm the guitar player, but do you think the bass player could play rhythm guitar on this? Because I want to play bass on the stick. And I kind of like completely upset the band dynamic, I think. And a couple weeks of that, and I suddenly found myself without a band. And we'd spent a year kind of writing songs and putting this thing together. And I was like, man, I don't want to go through that again of like having this long time getting a project going and then it goes nowhere. So I thought, well, the stick is such a good instrument as a solo musician that if I can get that together, I'll always have that to fall back on. And I can go collaborate and do whatever bands I want to do, but I can always come back to the solo thing on the stick. Um, so that I got the stick in 97. I started really practicing on it probably later that year. I got it in the summer. And so I had about a year and a half period where I know I was practicing about 20 hours a week on it, about 4 hours a day. Um, and at the time I got it, there were only two books in print for it. So I bought both books, kind of worked through them music school style, cover to cover. And then along the way, started writing some material and did, my first goal was a first album with my group Agent 22. And we kind of put that together in 98, came out in 99. And that was kind of the start of, the stick is the focus. And there were a number of years there were a number of years where you talk about the idea of following what you feel called to do. There were a number of years where my abilities on guitar were declining as my abilities on stick were going from nothing to barely anything. And there was a moment there where I couldn't really do much of anything on anything. And that was the moment where it was like, okay, you know, I, I think at one point my dad actually wrote me a letter going, "What are you doing with your life?" Um, but you fast forward a little bit, and in the end of '99, once that first CD was out, I managed to get Agent 22 into a local music contest at the Belly Up, and we got in just tail end. They were doing like you'd compete for best of the week, then you'd go on best of the month, best of the quarter, best of the year, and Agent 22 over right at the end of the year, like 4 weeks in a row, we wound up winning best of the year. And at that point, like both my parents had no doubts. They were just kind of like, "We don't understand what you're doing, but just keep doing it." And here I am. So
What, what a great story.
yeah,
Man, that is, I mean, talk about a leap of faith, right?
yeah, yeah,
Especially when, as you say, you were sort of balancing between the two and
right.
what am I doing here?
Yeah, and it is a very different instrument, but these days I play guitar enough again that I feel like my skills are back to, they're pretty compatible on both instruments. But the learning curve for stick, what I really found coming from this big guitar background was I very clearly learned there were three hurdles I had to get over. One of them was the fact that the melodic voice on the stick is typically your right hand. So as a guitar player, you're used to thinking of scales and notes in the left hand, especially if you're doing like an improvised solo or something. There's sort of this connection between your brain and your left hand. Well, that's now flip-flopped, and that's the right hand, generally. And then the other hurdle was the tuning on the bass side is totally different. The tuning on what we call the melody side, the top six strings, is close to a guitar. I'll give you that later. But the tuning on the bass is unlike anything else I know. And so there was a whole new geography there to learn of chord shapes and where things are laid out. And then the biggest hurdle is one that every stick player, I think, keeps pushing their own boundary is how much can you break the two hands apart to be doing two different parts at once? And that challenge sort of never goes away. You keep kind of pushing it further back, but then you find some new thing you can't do and you try to get over it. So
So now you say doing two things at once, but really in a way you're doing three, right? Bass, comping, and melodies,
yeah, yeah.
improv.
I mean, it obviously depends on the music and the piece, and the instrument itself can be used in a lot of different ways. Like there are people who will just use it primarily as a bass, where you might be using two hands just on the bass side. Typically, as a solo player, you want to fill up as much room as you can, and so the tuning is such that the low strings are in the middle, and they're tuned in fifths coming up this way. The melody strings are low here and go higher this way in fourths. And what that does is the fifths allow you to play low in a bass range with one finger, while the other fingers are jumping in range quick enough that you're actually playing a chord voicing above it. So it's bass and chords in one hand typically, and then the other hand can be other chords or melodies above it. So yeah, typically you can kind of juggle sort of three roles at once in there, but they can be very interwoven or they can be very separate.
Wow. I mean that just trying to follow the thought process as you
Yeah,
described that is amazing. So BJ did mention that the stick became commercially available in
correct.
1974, but I think it was sort of back in the late 60s that Emmett was developing the instrument. Now,
Exactly.
looking in your studio, I see I'm counting four Chapman sticks,
Yep.
and my question along those lines is, let's say, okay, I wanna play the stick. Do I call Emmett and say, here's what I want, here's are my parameters,
Mhm.
or is there a standard model, or can you get them tailored to your desires?
They have a lot of options, and I think Emmett's always tried to, appease anybody's thoughts about where this could go. When it first started, that first production run, and I think for a number of years, there was just one model, and it was a 10-stringed instrument. This is 12, but it was essentially this tuning, but just two fewer strings on the outer ends, really. And, one pickup, one tuning. That's what it was for a while. Somewhere around the time, shortly before I got into it, I think it was probably in the early 90s, or maybe a little earlier, he started doing the 12-string stick and he started offering different wood choices. There was a period in the 80s where he made them out of a polycarbonate. And I do have one for those that live in the area. If you've ever been to the museum and making music, I have one I loaned to the museum. And that's what that one is. It's actually polycarbonate. It was like an injection molded instrument. But he's always been experimenting, um, partly he's trying to make his life easier, I think, in terms of the setup, because it looks like a 2x4 with strings, but they spend a lot of time trying to get the strings as low and close to the board as they can. And so there's a lot of craftsmanship and patents and funny little techniques to do that. And so over the years, he's experimented. There was the polycarbonate era. Um, like I said, I think early 90s, maybe the 12 strings came in, and you suddenly had, they also added some, let me pick up one I'm not wearing, but you had um, an adjustable bridge, more like you'd find on a guitar or bass, which allowed for different tunings. And so suddenly people could get into trying different tunings more, like what happens if you drop these strings down a fourth, or tune it as two guitars or something. He also then started having different options of pickups. I think when I really started to get into it, you had three choices of pickups, plus you could get a MIDI option, which is really a Roland guitar synth pickup that's been modified to fit the stick. I don't know how well that goes over the interweb, but they take the guitar pickup and actually cut it into its six individual string pieces, flatten out the curve, squeeze them tighter together, and re-embed it in an acrylic, I think. And then you suddenly can do guitar synth stuff on here as well. But he keeps evolving it, and so in more recent years, one of his um, well, you'll see there's another one back here that's quite different, which has been around for a while. This is the most radically different one I have. This is actually called the NS Stick, and it's a collaboration between Emmett and the designer Ned Steinberger, who is famous for headless guitars and basses, and these days makes upright basses and cellos and things, electrics. Um, but so it's headless, based on Ned, and Ned had a lot of input on how that would work. But they put this together to be sort of a hybrid where it's kind of like a bass player's Chapman stick. So it's tuned more like a bass guitar. It can be tapped or picked and strummed. Any technique is possible on it, but it's tuned one direction, unlike the regular, more conventional stick tuning. So that's the NS stick. But he keeps coming up with new things, and I think one other one that's been a really big deal for them is that he came up with the idea of making sticks in essentially an OCP machine, a router, where rather than take a wood block and put frets in it, which he has his own way of doing that, that's very different from guitar and bass, they actually mapped out Emmett's fret filings and all his fret adjustments and put it in a computer, and they stick in a block of aluminum, and the machine routes out in between to create the frets. And so they call that the rail board, and that was intended to be, and it is a little less expensive because there's a little less work involved with them. Um, but it's a little different sounding. I'm still a traditionalist, I guess, as a stick player and play the wood instruments. But
That's
yeah,
that.
you can go through their website and they've got all kinds of options, and then you essentially have to make the hard choice of like which one do I want, and then you start choosing whether you're inlays, markers, or dots or lines, and what those are made out of, and what color tuners, and which pickup, and then you put in your order, and they get to work on it.
Wow, that's amazing. And you
Yeah,
mentioned the one that you have loaned us for the museum.
right.
And I will say, I love when I'm in the interactive area, which is where it's near, and I heard people looking at it saying, "What is that?" It
Yeah.
gives me an
What
opportunity.
what was so funny, and maybe BJ remembers this, but I think when the museum first opened, there were the touch panels that have little musical examples, and there was actually a Chapman Stick example, and it was a sample of one of Emmett's recordings from one of his albums. But there was no stick there, and there was nothing to tell you about the stick other than this button you push that was said Chapman Stick. And I thought, yeah, right. Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, for me walking through as yeah, for me walking through as a stick player, I was like, well, I know what that is, but who's going to have any clue what this button is? And so then it turned into a thing of like, I don't know if I talked to Emmett first or um, I think Emmett initially didn't know what the museum was, and he didn't want to loan a stick because in his mind, he's always just trying to get them out to players to begin with. So to have one sitting in a display wasn't as interesting as getting it to a player. So I loaned you guys the one that's up there, and then Emmett eventually came down and we did a concert there together. And once he saw the museum, then suddenly he was sending you like another instrument and all these accessories, and there was suddenly a display, but the recording sample was gone. So it's funny. But yeah, another interesting story about that one that's up at the museum is that it was actually owned by Tony Levin, who is the first person a lot of us see playing stick. And it was Tony's back in the 80s when he was doing some really major albums like with Peter Gabriel and I think Yes and Pink Floyd. And it's on a lot of those albums. So I came across it just because a friend of mine had it, and I kind of bribed him out of it. And then the first time I opened for Tony, I actually took it along and had him sign it. So
That's amazing. And I'm sorry, I keep forgetting that when I click out of my window, I can't unmute myself. I'm still learning this.
I did the same thing. I had myself muted because my chair is really squeaky and I'm typing at the same time, and you can hear the clack, clack, clack on my keyboard. So I have a button over here that will mute my microphone just like that. And so you guys can still hear me, but the audience couldn't hear me because I had my mute button on. Sorry, guys. I promise you I will perfect my presentation skills.
You know what? If I don't know what's going on, I'll just keep talking. So just make sure when we get to the end of this thing, we all sign off, because otherwise I'll be here tomorrow just kind of riffing on.
Exactly.
Overnight stick concert.
Yeah.
So I do want to start, getting into where we're going to hear some of this amazing instrument.
Sure.
The first time I heard you play, you were playing a solo gig, and you were employing the MIDI technology, and the sounds coming out of your instrument, your setup, were just heavenly. I'm serious. I just wanted to sit and tune everything else out and listen. A couple of questions. How much of the sound, Tom, that you're able to coax out of the instrument is from your tapping technique? How much it is from the incorporation of MIDI, from effects that you might have dialed in?
Sure. Almost everything is tapping. It's kind of the inverse of a guitar player. Guitar players can tap, but for most guitar players, tapping is sort of like a side technique. And for me on the stick, anything picking or strumming wise is sort of the side technique. It's like a special effect that I do just to not be tapping everything. So that's something I do as much as anybody does on it, I think, but it's still a rarity. As far as sound, I get very into programming multi-effects units. And I think, if I don't get us in trouble here, you can see kind of the rack behind me.
Yeah.
I don't know how much, So, what I run the stick through is just my own design, but essentially the melody side goes through two multi-effects processors, and then the bass side goes through one multi-effects processor. Then there's another strip for the guitar synth, and there's a 4-channel looper back there. And so the foot pedals that I have don't have any audio in them. They're used to just control the rack, but it's a question of... sometimes the multi-effects I do are so layered and so heavy that people think they're hearing a synth and they're really not. So the times when I'm using a synth, it's usually pretty obvious that it's a synth. And I've tended to use sounds that it's funny. I've tended to take organic sounds but use them in very non-organic ways. I've never been interested in trying to make it sound like a piano or something, but I'll take the sample of a choir and play it like an octave lower than the choir would be, and it's just kind of this low, weird, ominous thing. Or one patch I like to use is actually I think it's a shakuhachi flute, like a Japanese flute, but again I play it like 2 octaves too low or something. And so it's fairly obvious that it's a synth, but it's kind of hopefully used in a different way.
Well, I'll tell you what, you've whetted my appetite. I would love to hear some.
Sure. Let me do this. Do you want to actually hear a full piece, or just I'll run through a little demo of the sounds?
How about a sound demo?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna kill the mic just so I don't obliterate everyone here. But I'll start out with the basic sound of the instrument, and then I'll dress up the melody side. So I like to do this as a demo where I'll keep the bass side clean, but you'll hear the melody shift into something radically different, maybe 2 different sounds there, and then I'll bring in the synth as the final thing, so you can kind of hear that. So hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah. Nice.
There are so many adjectives to describe what we just heard there in those few
Hopefully
seconds.
positive ones.
Oh man,
Oh yeah.
absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
I'm a huge fan of sort of overdriven, creamy lead guitar sounds, and
Yeah,
some of
it's
those were
you
in there.
just because we're talking about Emmett and the Stick, you reminded me. Emmett is an amazing person to talk to, and you go over to his house because that's where they make them. And I used to always laugh because if I had to use the restroom, I'd go in and like the bathroom reading material was like Scientific American, and you would have these conversations, and he would go off. Our friend Greg Howard would call Emmett a tangentialist, and you can talk to him, and he'll take these turns in the conversation you don't expect. But one time I was talking to him, I think by phone. I have no idea what we were talking about, but somehow he went off on this tangent about how comes a lot of the terms people give musicians as praise could be taken as like an insult. And I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, if they say you're incredible, it's like saying you have no credibility. Or if they say you're fantastic, you're a fantasy. Or, he had this whole list, and I was like, what? So,
Wow, that's way deeper thinking than I would ever be accused of.
yeah, yeah,
And trust me, any compliments I give you are on the good side.
perfect.
Now, when you played those samples just a second ago, was there any MIDI in there? I think I heard a little
Yeah,
bit of a choir
yeah.
sneaking in.
I'll leave my mic on and just keep it low volume, and I hopefully don't kill you. But the MIDI sound I brought up was one that I do sometimes. It is kind of a choir.
Hmm.
And the way I have things set up, I actually have a switch. I use the switch on the MIDI pickup that I can reach down with my hand and change the sound. So this would be like the shakuhachi kind of sound I use sometimes. Um, this one is one that if a show's really not going well, I'll bring this in. Oh, not that. This. So, yeah, see, it works. It works every time. Bill started clapping instantly.
Bring your own applause. I love it.
Yeah, desperate
So,
situations.
Tom, what you were doing just there, I mean, this is, I hope we do go all night because this is
Yeah,
taking me on such a wonderful ride.
sure.
Uh, those sounds are so heavily incorporated in film score music. Do you do any film scoring? Have you been asked to? Have you been involved in any?
I haven't been specifically asked. I've had people take some tracks and use them, sometimes with permission, sometimes with not, which is kind of interesting. One of the funnier ones that happened a couple years ago was I got an email from the National Film Board of Canada, and they had done a documentary with a guy, and they were doing an interview with him at a live event. And it just happened that a friend of mine named Jim Meyer was up there, and he was in the background playing just his background music for the event. And he was playing one of my songs. And they were interviewing this guy, and they caught Jim in the background, and they're like, well, they needed this interview clip. And they couldn't get rid of the music, so they knew they were forced to license the music. And so I was in this weird position of like going, and they emailed me right when they realized what this was. And I was in this weird position because that's sort of a negotiated rate. And I thought, well, I could totally hold up this movie. And I got him right where I want him. And then I start talking to my friend Jim about what this movie is. And he's like, well, it's a nonprofit documentary. It's only shown in Canadian film festivals. And I'm kind of like, okay, they don't have a budget. All right. So we worked it out. I will say this, the check from the Canadian government was much, much more beautiful looking than anything I've seen from the U.S. Treasury. It's multicolored and it's just gorgeous. The exchange rate not as gorgeous, but it was still a good day. So
Wow, two real nice things about that story. One, that they actually did the right thing and said, we're
oh
going
yeah,
to find this gentleman and make sure we license his music. Because,
oh yeah,
I mean, as as we all know, artists today are facing such an upheaval the way music can be just, I
oh
mean,
yeah,
you can rip it, you can play it, and
right.
the artist doesn't get any of the royalties. And then hats off to you, really, for being a gentleman and saying, yeah, I could hold them up, but I realize where they are and I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, you got to meet people where they are, and it's, as far as I know, a good organization. I guess it's kind of like their PBS is what it was described to me. But yeah, the other side of that coin is a funny one where I'm a writer with BMI, the royalty organization, and I had a check come in, or a statement come in from them that showed one of my songs getting played on YouTube. And I think the first time I saw it, it was something like 50,000 plays in a quarter. And I thought, what is this? Like, I have no video for this song. There's nothing, I didn't put this up there, and I own all the rights to it. And I started searching around. It took a minute, and I found what is basically an ad or a descriptive video on airbrush tattoos. And looked like a little Hispanic boy, maybe in Mexico. I thought at first it was an ad for a tattoo parlor in Mexico that was using my music as their soundtrack. And since then, the last time I looked, because it keeps showing up on these royalty statements, now there's about 6 different versions of the same video with different text overlaid, and a lot of it's in Arabic. And I thought, I don't know what this is, but it's all this airbrush tattoo how-to or something. And, so it keeps streaming this song that I never allowed anybody to use, but, the royalties are pretty funny. I mean, the 50,000 plays was something like 23 cents, I think. So, yeah, start a new IRA with that one. But, yeah, whatever. I guess it's better than not having 23 cents. So.
If nothing else, you have a great story.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I had heard that same sort of thing about a lot of where music gets played, and
Right.
the royalty rate is very, very, very minimal like that.
Yeah, streaming is a weird world for sure.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Let's get back to the stick. You
Sure.
you mentioned that you've got the bass strings going in one direction as far as amplification, the guitar strings in another, and
Mhm.
yet a third for the MIDI itself. Is that
Right.
correct?
Correct.
So maybe for the tech people who might be watching, give us sort of a glimpse of where they're going and how they're sent out to these different amplifiers.
Well, it all starts the stick itself. Um, on pretty much any stick, you're going to have the main pickup here. And what this actually is 2 different pickups in one. And so both of those head out to one jack, a stereo or TRS tip ring sleeve jack. And from there we use a Y cable. It's actually a Mogami cable that goes out and kind of Ys out in 2 directions. While I'm holding this, the synth pickup then is a third output over here. And that uses Roland's proprietary 13-pin cable. But the 2 main outputs, people do all kinds of different things with them. Some players will run the bass side to a bass amp and the guitar side to a guitar amp. That was maybe the original way people really played the thing. My setup, excuse me, is a little more like a PA setup in a weird way. Again, I'm not going to pan the camera for fear of losing the world, but we tried that at soundcheck yesterday and it didn't work for those of you at home. But I run everything. The bass and guitar both go to their own preamps. Then they go to the multi-effects units I'm talking about. Those dump into a mixer, I think you can see up here. And then the synth has its own outputs and meets up at the mixer. And from the mixer, I route out basically it's kind of like an aux send return, although on this Mackie, it's actually they call it Alt 3/4 out. And it has this funny routing where I can use the mute switches on the mixer, that when the mute switch is down, it'll actually go to the looper and the main output. And so I can reach over and quickly hit the mute switch and decide which part of this instrument is going to the looper. And then the looper again is here as kind of a 4-track digital recorder that I can kind of record apart and then play other stuff on top of it. They all meet up at the mixer again, and the output of that goes into the effects returns of a bass head, which is a way I've been doing it for about 20 years. And it's actually a rarity these days because it's a stereo bass head. And so I've got, I think you can see them on camera. The only 2 stereo bass heads I've found that are currently made are both sitting right over here. There's an Eden World Traveler and an Ampeg SVT 4 Pro that I'm both messing with to see if they, what I want to go forward with, because this SWR isn't made anymore, unfortunately. But the stereo bass head works as like a stereo power amp and actually drives 2 bag end cabinets. And so in a live setting, that's at the very least my monitors or the bag end cabinets. And, if it's a smaller gig, that might be what the audience is really hearing too. Bigger gigs, I take another output from the mixer and run it to a house sound system. And then, I've still got the sound I'm used to from the bag ends, but I've also got the house is getting what they want, which is actually what we're sending you guys today is the direct from the mixer. So, and I'm not, again, going to pan down, but the foot pedals down here are actually an old Roland FC200 controller that's, it's got about 12 individual foot switches, and then I've got 5 expression pedals. And so I've got like volume pedals. I've got one that's the synth volume, one that's the guitar volume, one that's the bass volume. And then on the other side, I've got 2 that go to the looper as to control track 1, track 2 volume on the looper. But the main pedal has 3 different modes. And so one mode, it's just changing patches on the effects units to get different sounds on both sides. Another mode, it's actually sending MIDI continuous controller numbers to the looper to start and stop recording or switch tracks, do that kind of thing. And the third mode, it actually turns into a 1-octave keyboard. And I'll actually sometimes play the same synth sounds with my feet. So I might be playing like a bass chord arpeggio here and play synth with my feet as kind of a lead melody. So,
BJ, what do you think of that? He's sort of giving you a run for your money as a drummer.
Well, yeah, as drummers, we have a love-hate relationship with loopers because anybody can be a drummer at that point. And then it's actually it forces drummers, especially if there's melodic loops. Like when I'm playing with my my bandmates, he'll do a guitar riff and it'll be locked in over 8 bars, 16 bars, 32 bars. So one of us has to have a really good metronome internally. So when that rolls back around and it hits the loop, I mean, for me, I'm not on the loop, but you gotta really listen deep for that rhythm and ignore everything else that's going on, because if you deviate from that rhythm that is being looped, that has been recorded, then
right. Like my friend Ryan and I with the 8, he's a drummer. We play together as Agent 22, and I call it the lopsided click track, because it's like if I happen to mean to play 16 beats and I play 15 and 7/8 of a beat or something, every time that loop comes around, you got to lean forward on the time a little bit just to kind of like push it and keep things together.
Strong backbeat on 11 and 15, that sort of thing.
Yeah, right.
And BJ, you actually took that down a different road than I was meaning to. All I meant was Tom, at a certain point, is playing with all 4 digits. It sounds like both hands, both feet, right?
Right, all 4
limbs. Oh well,
that's
that's a sign of camaraderie. If you can do that, man, you can be a drummer's friend any day of the week. So I was more going down the line of the looping. That's where I was. That's what always sticks in my craw.
BJ's
got an innate fear of looping.
Yeah, exactly.
Came right out.
Yeah. Apologies, I certainly wasn't trying to throw that at you.
Yeah.
Gosh, Tom, so many things come to mind when you're talking about this. You mentioned hearing your sound out of the bag end speakers, even in a larger gig, so that you can hear what you are used to sonically. And the fact that really musicians, particularly guitar players in the last 20, 30 years at least, have now been required to become scientists, technicians as well. That whole gamut that you ran through as far as your routing, your looping, where this goes, how you control all these elements. It's just amazing. It's mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, it's a weird thing because the rig that I have kind of grew over a number of years, maybe like a 2 or 3 year period where I was really starting to do shows and I would kind of figure all this out. And these days it's so much a part of the instrument that a lot of the things I use aren't made anymore. I've become vintage without meaning to, And so I like the reason I have these other bass heads is I keep looking for other things that will function and be comfortable as really part of the instrument. And it's a little bit of a struggle. I've been going through this process lately of trying different loopers. And I run into funny issues. Like I got one that looked like it was going to do everything I needed by the online specs. But then I didn't even think about the fact that on this looper, I kill the dry signal going through it because I'm using it as like an aux send, a send return from the mixer. As I'm playing live, the sound is going to the looper, but you're not hearing it through the looper. You're hearing it through everything else. If you'd heard it through the looper, there's a weird delay and there's kind of a phasing thing that happens and it doesn't sound right. And so I got this other looper just assuming it would be able to kill the dry signal, and lo and behold, it doesn't. I'm like, oh, come on. The search goes on. So
the quest for the loop continues.
Yeah. Yeah.
A bit like the quest for the Holy Grail, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to hear, if you're good with it, a complete piece, and maybe
Sure.
utilize as much of these aspects that you've mentioned, the looping,
Sure.
maybe some of the volume, the EV pedal, the expression pedals to bring
Right.
things in and out.
Yeah.
Just kind of give us the whole
Yeah. I
smorgasbord.
thought I would do this. I've got, this is a piece that's been around for a number of years, but it uses some of the different sounds at the end as well as the looper. It doesn't use the synth, but maybe we'll give you a little taste of that afterwards. But this is something of mine called Don't Look Back.
Yeah, all right.
Ah,
That
oh,
sounded great.
BJ,
Yeah.
our discussion on the fear of looping bit me because I'm not. It's funny. I'm not used to playing sitting down. I usually stand up, and in the
Ah,
process of pivoting on a piano bench, I messed up some of the pedaling in the middle, and you got to hear the loop go by one more time as I figured it all out. So that's good. True
Setting up
it
confessions.
that
sounded
anticipation
great.
for more.
Yeah, nice.
That's that. Oh, man, beautiful. I don't know how many adjectives I can come up with. That was
Yeah,
stunningly gorgeous. I mean, definitely as you're going along, close your eyes. You can easily visualize 3, 4, 5 people playing at once.
yeah, yeah.
Fantastic.
That's the goal.
Goal achieved.
Thanks.
And, as I was listening, one of the things that caught my ear is the sound of the bass, especially the lower notes. They've just got
Sure.
such a rich, robust, and yet a tangy tone to them. And I got to
Yeah,
wondering, where do you get string sets for a Chapman stick?
oh, you have to get them right from Emmett. They're actually made by Diodario, who make strings for pretty much every kind of instrument on the planet, including headless guitars from Steinberger and things. But in the case of the stick, Emmett actually gets them to custom make them, and I think he buys 144 of each individual string at a time, and he's got these giant bundles in his closet, and then he has people go through and make string sets, and most of them are pretty typical D'Addario guitar strings, with the exception that they're longer. Because this stick is actually a 36-inch scale length, so it's more like a scale length of a bass, but you're trying to put guitar strings on it. So a normal guitar string would probably stop about here. You wouldn't make it all the way. So I think 10 of the 12 strings would fit that description where they're long guitar strings. The lowest two bass, I believe, are actually custom. And once again, I'm not sure how well this will come across the interwebs, but I don't know if you can see right down there, there's actually a taper to it, which is a little unusual. So right before it hits the bridge piece here, the windings of the string actually taper down, and it's a little skinnier when it's actually on the bridge piece. So that helps make it a little more flexible, which again makes it a little more easy to tap. And you can get stick strings in different gauges, but all of them are generally a little lighter than a typical guitar or bass string, again, to make tapping easier. And the sum total of all that stuff, plus the low action and a little less tension, means the bass, like you're saying, is a pretty robust sound, but it also has a great clarity to it. I think partly the attack, like on a traditional bass, especially finger picking, it's a warmer attack. A single note takes up a little more space sonically, whereas on the stick, you still have that low fundamental, but it's a little more clear, so you can put these other things right above it and kind of interweave things a little more.
Right. I think partly because of the tapping action,
Sure.
you're getting not only the string tone, but also a bit of the fret tone as well. It's sort of that metallic fret.
Yeah, well, it's metal. It's metal against metal on that point. So your attack is the string actually hitting the fret, not you're holding it and the attack is like a finger or a pick.
Yeah. And in particular, as you're saying, bass player, if you're playing with a finger, the tone, I think a lot of it is created by actually the pad of your fingertip.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah,
So, just for fun, I come to you and I say, wow, I want to learn how to play that instrument.
yeah.
What's your advice?
Um, get one. That's the first hurdle. I mean, it really is. It's
let me ask you, Tom. Is there a intro model Chapman stick like? Because I know these. It's what I consider a considerable investment. When you're going for this, I don't think they're like when you pick up a guitar. There's many different levels and points to be able to get into it.
right.
But do they have a version that is like a student stick model?
Not exactly. I think that's partly what Emmett was aiming for with the railboard, the metal one. Um, I think he had said, I think publicly, I think I can repeat this, that he had hoped the cost on it would be even less than it is. It's a little bit cheaper than the wooden sticks because there's less manual labor involved. But I think the cost of the parts kind of kept it from being as cheap as he would have liked. Um, I mean, you could certainly take some of the techniques and start to apply them to guitar as a starting point. Emmett refers to this technique because really, before he created the instrument, he created the technique. And so the whole idea of playing two hands this way, with both hands kind of parallel to the frets and both hands equal partners, is something we now call free hands. And Emmett is the first person we know of that actually started playing guitar that way. So like Emmett did, you could start trying to learn to play guitar this way, but you'd be working a lot harder than you would if you had the stick, because your strings are going to be a little higher. You're going to have to hit everything a little harder. So yeah, I mean, if you can get one, that's the best starting point. I usually advise people, if they can get one, the 10 string is probably the first one to get. And as I said, they have a lot of different pickup options, but of the standard pickups, you know, one of my favorite sounds is still his original pickup, which these days he calls the stick up. And that happens to be, I think, the least expensive pickup to get. So that's what I usually advise people, is get a 10 string with the stick up as your starting point.
Now, if you were to, say, get in touch with Emmett and order one, what kind of turnaround time are we looking at?
Oh, that's a big subject. And part of it is, you know, they take used ones back in and they'll kind of clean up and retrofit used ones. So if you get lucky, you might call them and they have a used one and you get it right away. If you're doing a brand new build custom instrument, you know, they used to say, I want to say they used to say 3 months or so, but I know, like, I have a stick student who actually ordered one and it took a lot longer than that. And it's partly just what's going on in their world. You know, it is a family business. It's basically Emmett and his daughter and a couple other employees. And I half jokingly say their big corporate expansion was they added a second garage to the house a number of years ago. And so it's 2 garages and an office, and they do them in runs. So they do I think they still do about maybe 30 instruments at a time in what they call a run. So they kind of have the wood or whatever, and they put the frets in, and then they move it along, and they do the next step to all of them. So depending on where you happen to hit them in their run in the cycle, that affects the timing too. So yeah, usually they're in enough demand that they can't make them fast enough. So realistically, you know, if you want one, place the order today. Tell them I sent you. I don't get anything out of it other than that they like me for that. And but you know, you'll be waiting a little while if they have to make one from scratch.
Sweet. I mean, I love the down-home nature of that business. So
Yeah.
that's beautiful. Tom, we're coming up on an hour, and I
Okay.
really want to thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
You've been over generous. BJ, do we have any questions or any parting thoughts on your end?
I mean, on my end, I'm always amazed by instruments like this, and always amazed by where we're going, especially with new instrument innovations. I mean, in my mind, in my own personal, experience, the Chapman Stick is one of the really recent developments in the past, well, almost 40 years, but still, I mean, even since then, now obviously we've had a lot of technological innovations, a lot of electronic music innovations, but like as far as instrument wise, like
Sure.
acoustic instruments and electric instruments like this, it's one of the kind of the forefront outliers that you can't really say a whole lot about other instruments like the trumpet, trombone, instruments that have been around for decades, centuries, a long time. Then the stick is kind of, it always kind of is that marker that I point to, is like innovation is still happening, it's still out there, and people are still actively creating to find ways to make music and make it presented in new ways, make music differently, and
Sure.
I think that's exciting.
Yeah,
So
and
that's just my comment.
No, and you're right on it, because that was, Emmett would say, I think that's what sort of drove him to come to the idea of playing in both hands on a guitar. That he wanted to be in control of both the melody and the chords happening. He wanted to be able to change both of those. But as a guitar player, you're typically playing one or the other. You're typically playing melody or chords. And I heard him say once that he wanted to sort of crossbreed Jimi Hendrix as far as the crazy melodic expression, but with jazz piano. And this is what he came up with. So, but you're right. And it's worth pointing out too, that as much as we've been talking about the electronics of the stick, it really is a acoustic instrument. You can you pick it up and play it, you hear it. It's not like a MIDI keyboard or something. There's nothing. You're hearing the sound of the instrument amplified. So.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Exactly.
What a mind Mr. Chapman has to think of Jimi Hendrix with
jazz piano. Yeah.
Can we sort of, BJ, you're the master controller here, so yes or no on this, but can we do a play out to finish this up?
You know what? Because Tom's studio sounds so good today, and I'm so excited to hear the stick play. I would be happy if Tom accepted a gracious invitation to play one more of his tunes
Sure.
for our end of the episode today. Would you be able to do that for us, Tom?
Oh yeah, of course. I'll try to do something that's maybe a little weirder, I think. Do we have to keep it short? I mean, I'm not talking like 20-minute
like
yes epic.
4 or 5 minutes, maybe
Okay.
15 if you got it. If you have an arrangement that in movements. No, we're coming to the top of the hour, but we've got time for one of your tunes.
Okay, let me do this. I'll if midstream, I'll see if I can condense it a little. It'll be the radio edit version of something called Victor's Chase.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom.
Yes.
It gives me chills up and down my neck every time I hear that instrument played, especially in the hands of a very capable musician like yourself, and inspiring other capable musicians out there as well. I want to thank you, Mr. Bill, too, for helping guide the discussion today. I'm going to go ahead and talk us out, saying thank you to everyone. Thank you for joining us today at Mom at Home. I hope you enjoyed our presentation with Tom Griesgraber and the Chapman Stick. Definitely an instrument to check out, maybe if you're so inspired to learn as well. And other than that, we hope you join us for next week's Mom at Homes. We're going to be posting the next batch of events on our website shortly. Every Wednesday, Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific time, we're going to be talking about wonderful musical topics with some amazing guests, include just like we had today with Tom. So until then, we will see you then. Take care and have a great day.